But welcome everybody. Please do like, share, subscribe, support the platform however you would like to. Just did put a video out of slight disagreement with Professor Jessica Gordon Nemhard and something she said on a panel hosted by Geechee about cooperatives. And again, I don't know how willful it is, but there does seem to be some confusion. Someone hit me up on a clip from that I put up on Instagram, and someone from Cooperation Jackson again hit me up like the last time I said, and you know, it felt a little off, but I'm not condemning or being critical of cooperatives. I'm certainly not critical of Cooperation Jackson. And as I reminded them the last time, someone from that wonderful organization misheard me about what I'm saying here. I invited and had a discussion with Kali Akuno just to clarify. Again, I'm not taking shots at anybody who's operating in cooperatives. I'm not taking shots certainly at Cooperation Jackson. I'm not, in the same way, my buying power argument is not taking shots at people who open up businesses necessarily. I'm simply saying in that last video, and all I'm saying about Professor Nemhard's work and her argument is that I don't agree with using DuBois as central to an argument in defense of cooperatives while ignoring his later rejection of cooperatives and in favor of socialism. So and ultimately all I would be wanting to be added to the conversation is Du Bois at one point thought cooperatives would work, gave it a shot. He explains later why it doesn't work, or he thought it wouldn't work. But we're going to give it a shot in the 21st century in the context we're in, as a survival program or as a mechanism to help each other out while we're developing new levels of political organization and et cetera and so forth, maybe even considering what Du Bois himself argued for, becoming more aggressive about advocating for socialism. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying would have to be added to the conversation. It's not saying don't do cooperatives. I'm certainly not critical of anybody engaged in cooperatives, and I'm definitely not critical of Cooperation Jackson. I'm simply critical of the approach just in terms of the scholarship and the history and the historical record. That's it. So, and by the way, I said this, I didn't say it most recently, but I have said that not in the same way, because I don't use Abram Harris as a centerpiece of my argument around buying power. But similarly, the extent to which I do refer to Abram Harris in my work, I do in his condemnation of buying power. It would be appropriate to note that he apparently later in life changed and became very pro-capitalist and so on and so forth, in which case I'll go on to disagree with him, and that would be why. His initial critique of Black capitalism was correct. So that's all I would be saying in terms of a conversation about Du Bois and cooperatives. He at one point supported them, later did not support them. Here are his reasons why, and here are the reasons why I am either going to agree with him and adopt his politics or disagree with him and keep on doing something with cooperatives for the time being. All right. So, but I did just to, I went, you know, because in that last video and in several others, I've referred to this speech and in both in excerpts and in audio. I did just want to go back and read the whole thing, and there's a couple of other little gems in there. From 1960, Du Bois' Socialism in the American Negro. Democracy has so disappeared in the United States that there are some subjects that cannot even be discussed, as he opens up. And does that not, you know, that feels like we're back in that space where, as he says here, Senator McCarthy succeeded in making America afraid to discuss socialism or to recognize communism. I was criticized for being bitter, as seeking not simply political but social equality for Negroes, for favoring the teaching of Karl Marx, and for joining the Socialist Party. These accusations were true. And then he quickly recounts some of the history around there being a socialist push in this country before the First World War and through the Second World War. And then came the surge, as he says, towards socialism called the New Deal. Now, if I read him correctly here, he seemed to have a much, I don't know if I even agree with him on this one, because it sounds to me like he was saying that Roosevelt's New Deal was a necessary step towards socialism, in the same way people at one point were arguing Obamacare was a necessary step towards universal health care. And I think in both cases, these were not steps toward, but blockages against. And as others have pointed out, Roosevelt's New Deal was more about saving capitalism and preventing socialism than making a step towards socialism. But nonetheless, as DuBois says here, with the death of Roosevelt came reaction. The United States not only stopped progress towards socialism, and I don't know that that was, but ceased to discuss or study it and came to regard the object of socialism and communism as a crime, especially the American Negro. I happen to think this is a good point, and one of the reasons why the Black Power movement, and a point we'll come back to later tonight, the Black Power movement became such a targeted threat because it had adopted a militant form of socialist politics into a Black liberation context. So you put all that together and it's like, absolutely not. And we're still suffering the effects of this in 2025, where, to the point I started off with just a moment ago, we are not talking about whether it's socialism or any other form of militant redistribution. We're not even talking about that anymore, or we're encouraged not to talk about that. And please, I don't mean in the specific circles in which many of us in these spaces move. I'm talking about more broadly. So that's another kind of reason, not kind of, it is part of the reason why I am bothered when in this case Du Bois is referenced without a discussion of the socialism, because here he is saying we don't even talk about it. We're not learning about it. And as he gets to in this speech, that's sort of the point, that without doing that, we don't realize that so many of these other things we try to do within a capitalist society are not going to work. American Negroes were not socialists. They did not know that communism was doing or trying what communism was doing or trying to do, but they knew that Negro education must be better, that Negroes must have better opportunities to work and receive a wage that would let them enjoy a decent standard of life. Again, that sounds very similar to today. Many people in the Black community are not paying attention or not aware of what's happening in the broader socialist or BRICS or non-aligned world. They are still being forced to focus intently on better education and opportunities, including in the business community. They were victims of the disease and drifting into crime. I don't know how I feel about that. That I don't know. Sounds unnecessarily bougie, but whatever. But this is his point. But his point is that this is a derivative of the conditions being imposed. To remedy this, they sort of pattern their life after successful Americans, and that is exactly what is still happening now. We are being encouraged to do that. I got a perfect example to play later of a nightmare version of that, almost comedic, but nightmarish version of that. That if you're not like them, if you're not building like them, what are we talking about? A class structure began to arise within the Negro group, which produced haves and have-nots, intended to encourage more successful Negroes to join the force of monopoly and exploitation and help victimize their own classes and any other lower classes that were possible. That's exactly what's going on to this day. To remedy this situation, thinking Negroes still regarded their first step toward emancipation as being political power.
Message!
Moving ahead a little bit, this is again Du Bois saying, his point being, long story short, until I realized socialism was the ultimate goal here, I tried to plan an organization among Negroes as consumers, which would furnish employment, help savings, and bring unity of action. But it was soon evident, as many of my fellow workers warned me from the beginning, that individual action could not bring consumers cooperation, that without power of the government, it would fail. And with government cooperation, it was socialism. In my mind, there is no doubt but that the world of the 21st century will be overwhelmingly communistic. Well, that would have been great. He's talking about the civil rights movement, the NAACP, the bus boycott, the experience in Montgomery, the extraordinary uprising of students all over the South, and the beginning of the North shows an awareness of our situation, which is most encouraging, but it still does not reach the center of the problem. Again, that sounds a lot like today, where, whether it's whatever, or whatever, a lot of folks are not getting, so at the center, and that center is not simply the right of Americans to spend their money as they wish and according to law, but the chance for American Negroes to have money to spend because of employment by which they can make a decent wage. That is bars.
Now listen, that's called
know nothing about that. And it's still relevant to this day. This is exactly the same thing. And that stop. We're so much encouraged to focus on the spending and how we spend and where we have the ability to spend, and not on having money to spend based on an employment and an equal pay. What then is the next step? It is for American Negroes in increasing numbers and more widely to insist upon the legal rights which are already theirs, and then to add to that increasingly a socialistic form of government and insistence upon the welfare state, which denies the further carrying out of industry for the profit of those corporations which monopolize wealth and power. So my argument around stop arguing around buying power and consumption and spending habits, and focus more on the fact that there's $27 trillion every year created in this country through GDP, and it just needs to be better redistributed. This is mine is just, again, a child of this argument. The stopping of a government of wealth for wealth, and the returning of governmental power to the individual voter with all the freedom of action that can be preserved along with an industry carefully organized for the good of the masses of people and not for the manufacture of millionaires. Does capitalism offer such a program? It does not. It offers war. Wow, is that still prescient? We have no peace movement in the United States that deserves the name. And then he starts talking about this Collier's magazine issue, which is really interesting. On October 27th, 1951, 8.5 years ago, Collier's magazine, and I went and looked it up again. It was a very popular, well circulated elite magazine, a flamboyant pictorial with a circulation claimed to be 1.5 million, published a number in which the leaders of American science and literature made contributions. At the time when a few socialists in the United States dared to open their mouths and many were in jail, when economics and social science were being taught in institutions like this with the utmost caution, and when I was being handcuffed for advocating peace with the Soviet Union, this extraordinary magazine was on every newsstand and on radio and television. It predicted and described in 130 pages of the aggressive war of the United States against the Soviet Union, and the editors and contributors said that this year, 1960, would see the utter destruction of communism the world over, and the victorious American troops walking in the streets of Moscow. So that didn't happen either. And in fact, as I looked it up, in 1957, 3 years before 1960, the Collier's magazine folded up. And as DuBois says himself here, the year 1960 is come and is a third gone. What has happened? Collier's magazine is dead. It wanted 1.5 million readers. Its wanted 1.5 million readers have ceased to subscribe because the reduced prices which they charge for Collier's and a dozen other flashy periodicals which are thrust down our throats are not needed by the publishers. Saved as bait to advertisers who pay millions to make you buy their goods. He's doing my buying power argument in 1960. Perhaps our most unforgivable deed today is our attitude towards China. Historically in America, chinks have always rated below wops and niggers. Negroes were lazy and jolly, and this infuriated the slave drivers, but Chinese coolies worked like dumb-driven cattle. But for the prisoners in our own overcrowded jails who rebel each day and cry in vain for justice and mercy, our only remedy is more jails. This shows the increase in our religion. This shows why we tax Americans into crime, poverty, and suicide, and spend 10 times more for war than for education, health, and social security. They have, however, no right to prevent the truth about socialism from being told. They have no right to prevent students from studying the remarkable philosophy of Karl Marx. And then, as he points out, as while everybody's decrying communism and all of its intellectual constrictures and how it's going to limit the potential of humanity, they launch Sputnik and get up into space before the United States, which, by the way, has an eerie and unfortunate connection to the rise of African studies in this country. But especially American Negroes must know that this is what is going on in the world today, and learn for themselves what this has to teach them in order that they may preserve their culture, get rid of their poverty, ignorance, and disease, and help America live up at least to a shadow of its vain boast as land of the free and home of the brave. By the way, Americans have 300 million invested in South Africa, more than they did 10 years ago. So again, I just think it's important that if DuBois is going to be made the center or the foundation or a core component of an argument around cooperatives, that it actually ends up functioning in as a mechanism of the process he himself was describing in his lifetime as something that denies Black audiences a discussion of the world, of socialism, and in this case specifically of critiques of cooperatives. But again, I'm not denying the importance of cooperatives. I'm not saying don't engage in cooperatives. I'm not saying people who do cooperatives are the enemy. I'm not, none of these crazy things. I'm just simply saying what I've just said.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.